Hey, hello everybody, and welcome. I can see we still have folks shuffling in at the moment, but why don't we go ahead and get started? So hello everybody. I want to thank the audience for joining us From Corbyn to Sanders, our Zionist organizations targeting progressive politicians. This looks like it's going to be a really good turnout. And we are also live streaming this to Miko Peled's Facebook page. So if you'd like to share this event with folks who didn't register on Zoom ahead of time, you can let them know to head over to facebook.com/Miko Peled official. And they'll be able to watch the live stream from there. You can also just go to Facebook and in the very top search bar, type Miko Peled and it'll take you right to his page. So this is a two-part webinar series that Miko Peled and I cooked up shortly after Bernie Sanders kind of threw in the towel in his run to be the Democratic nominee. So with all of this reflection that is happening on both the side of the Sanders campaign, you know, what went right, what went wrong, but also reflecting on UK Labour's upset late last year, and especially regarding recent reporting that has just come out in the last couple of weeks, which I'm sure will be discussed today. We wanted to kind of probe the influence of special interest, pro-Israel political groups, different entities on these campaigns and their corresponding movements, particularly as it relates to their advocacy for Palestinian justice and freedom. So I want to thank this excellent panel that we've assembled here today, and I want to introduce them as well. So first off, we have former Labour MP for Derby North, City Council leader and activist, Chris Williamson. We've also got author of The Battle for Palestine and One Country, a bold proposal to end the Israeli-Palestinian impasse, and co-founder of the Electronic Intifada, Ali Abu Nima. We've got author of Politics, Another Perspective, commentary and analysis on race, war, ethics, and the American political landscape in the age of Obama. And this person also has an op-ed out right now on the Black Agenda report called COVID-19 in America, The Fire This Time. And he's also host of Inside the Issues, Dr. Wilmer Leon. And lastly, we've got author of The General Sun and Injustice, the story of the Holy Land Foundation 5. He's a human rights activist and host of the Miko Peled podcast, Miko Peled. So just some quick housekeeping rules for this event before I hand things over to Miko. We're hoping to keep this whole thing under 2 hours, with probably the first 60 to 80 minutes dedicated to the panel discussion. But we also want to make room for some audience Q&A once the panel discussion has wrapped up. So you'll see a little Q&A button down on your Zoom window toolbar. I think it's on the bottom of your screen. And if you have a question that you'd like the panel to address on this topic at any point during the event, and we're kind of asking folks to keep your questions within the ballpark of the discussion if you can, use that Q&A tool to ask your question, and our event administrator, Michael, will be collecting those throughout the event. If you're having any kind of technical difficulties or the audio is weird or anything like that, or you want to comment about what is being discussed with the other attendees, there is a little chat room, so feel free to use that. Michael, our event admin, is going to be monitoring that and responding. He's also going to be linking any articles or any reference materials that the speakers discussed there. So you can check that out. And then lastly, I want to let everybody know that we're hosting a part 2 of this event. It's the same topic, but it's with a totally different panel. And that's happening 1 week from today at the exact same time. So if you think everything on this topic is going to get covered today, think again. There's a lot to this. So you can register for part 2 at mikopeled.com. And I think that's everything. So I'm going to go ahead and pass the reins over to Miko.
Thank you, Jamil. Thanks for helping set this up and doing all the production. And thank you, Michael, who's behind the scenes there, going through the questions in the chat. Thank you, the panelists, Chris, Wilmer, and Ali, for participating in this. I think the question that we raise from Corbyn to Sanders are Zionist and pro-Israeli groups intervening and trying to influence when it comes to progressive politicians? I think in most people's minds, the answer is yes. I think in the progressive camp, a lot of people have a lot of information and know something about this. But it's an incredibly important topic to raise, and I think it's important to actually have the facts and have the information out there. So we defined three issues, three questions that that we can all discuss. We're going to discuss today to really investigate this and see what we know, what has happened, and what we can do to move forward beyond this. Both Corbyn and Sanders came very close to leading their countries. Jeremy Corbyn, I think in 2017, was only a few thousand votes short of becoming prime minister. Sanders wasn't quite that close, but he did come very, very close. And although they're not identical in their worldview, and Corbyn is probably much more progressive, in both cases, these were candidates that were very, very clear about their intents to hold Israel accountable and to recognize and support Palestinian rights, at least within the realm of international law and United Nations resolutions. And both of them were not able to do this. Both of them stopped short of of leading their countries. And again, the campaigns by the pro-Israeli groups, those of us that are paying attention, were fierce. In the UK, I was a little bit involved in what was happening in the UK because I was participating in some fringe events around the last three Labour Party conferences, which is where Chris and I met for the first time. And the first time I went, it seemed that there was this campaign, but it wasn't really working very well. Jeremy Corbyn was quite strong. I remember, Chris, I came to hear you speak at one of the events, and people in the audience were talking about the possibility of you becoming deputy leader and how this is going to move forward. And there was this real sense of optimism, and it all crashed, as we all know. And I'm going to ask you to talk about that a little bit. But there's a real sense that his stance on Palestine and your stance on Palestine and demanding justice and demanding to hold Israel accountable was a big part of his fault, and eventually also a big part of what had happened to you. And I'll let you talk. Like I said, I'll let you talk about this. We've seen, thanks to Al Jazeera, thanks to Al Jazeera, but really thanks to Electronic Intifada, we've seen the documentaries that were made about the Israeli lobby, both in the UK and in the US. So the information's out there. Probably not enough people have seen it, and the links are going to be available here. But it's obvious that there's a lot of work being done behind the scenes by pro-Israeli groups. And the weaponizing of anti-Semitism, the weaponizing of the Holocaust. I know at least in the UK, there were accusations against people who were supporters of Jeremy Corbyn that they were Holocaust deniers, even though they were not, that they were anti-Semitic, even though they were not. Certainly here in the UK, the strong pro-Israeli groups were not happy with Bernie Sanders criticizing Israel over attacking Gaza, and were very unhappy about his talking about conditioning aid to Israel with its compliance with international law regarding the Palestinians. So again, that's why I decided, we put together this panel to hear from people who have been involved, who've been talking about this, writing about this, discussing this. And the first question that we thought we would raise is, what evidence do we have that this is happening? What evidence do we have that demonstrates the targeting of US and UK progressive pro-Palestine politicians and electoral movements by these groups? And Chris, I think you probably more than anyone at this point have been, on the receiving end of this, and the results of the last elections have to do with this. So maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about the experience you've had with this over the last couple of years, and what your thoughts on this in general. So go ahead.
No, thanks very much indeed, Miko, for inviting me to participate in what I think is a very important discussion, because there's almost a shroud of secrecy about this, which is drawn over the role of the Zionists in actually targeting progressive politicians like Jeremy in the UK, myself, obviously, Bernie Sanders, AOC in the States, Ilhan Omar, because people are fearful. I mean, my experience is that I was targeted almost from the very first couple of weeks of being elected. I gave a lengthy interview to the Guardian newspaper and tried to address the various smears which are being levelled against Jeremy, which ranged from him being a Czech spy supporting dictatorships, etc., but also the issue of anti-Semitism. And I focused particularly on that because I made the point that, of all the people in the House of Commons, Jeremy Corbyn has got a record stronger than anybody else on fighting racism and bigotry in all its forms. And I said it was a dirty, low-down trick and bullshit was the term I used, and to the Guardian journalist, and she quoted me verbatim on that, and that then became a major issue, and it led to me being targeted by the so-called Jewish Labour movement, which, as the electronic intifada have identified, is really a front for the Israeli embassy. And I became public enemy number one. And because I was very close to the agenda that Jeremy Corbyn was promoting, I think they saw my scalp as being very important to undermining the whole Corbyn project. And, we know the evidence is there. I mean, not just in terms of what's happened to me, but the Al Jazeera documentary, which, you've already referenced, is very clear that there is involvement from the Israeli state. The Israeli diplomat who was exposed in that documentary had to go back to Israel, and the argument was, this is just a one-off, this is a rogue diplomat, this isn't typical. But it did actually lead Jeremy to ask some searching questions about it. It also led Emily Thornberry, who was the shadow foreign secretary, to call for a public inquiry into this, because, look, this is a very serious state of affairs where you have a foreign nation interfering in the democratic processes of a sovereign nation, i.e. the United Kingdom. And very clear evidence was identified in that documentary, but nothing was ever really done about it. I mean, questions were asked, but then both Jeremy and indeed Emily Thornberry went very quiet, silent on it, you might say. And Jeremy ended up just sort of firefighting these incessant accusations that he was an anti-Semite. And they just stepped it up and ramped it up. And the more that Jeremy sought to try and placate his assailants, the stronger they became. I mean, I said to Jeremy on a number of occasions, please stop apologizing, because you of all people have got nothing to apologize for. And every time you apologize, every time you give ground to the people who are attacking you, it's simply feeding the beast, making them stronger. And ultimately, all they're interested in doing is actually undermining and dismantling the Corbyn project and taking you out, Jeremy. But unfortunately, the people around him seem to feel that the best tactic was to, continually apologize in the hope that that would draw a line under it. I mean, and John McDonnell, who was a very close confidant of Jeremy, said on a number of occasions that we needed to do X, Y, or Z, and that would draw a line under it. I mean, for example, like adopting the IHRA examples, which, many anti-Zionist Jewish members of the party and many other socialist members of the party were very opposed to. I spoke at a rally outside the National Executive Committee meeting that was considering adopting all of the examples of the IHRA, and there was a big rally there. And most of the people at that rally were Jewish members and supporters of the Labour Party, you know. So, but the way it was portrayed in the media, the way our sort of opponents tried to portray it, was that it was a mainstream Jewish opinion in Britain that wanted Labour to adopt the IHRA, that felt Labour posed an existential threat to the Jewish community in Britain, and this was repeated over and over and over again on the national broadcast media outlets and in the print media outlets on a almost a daily basis.
Hey Chris, if I can just interrupt real quick, just to clarify to everybody, the IHRA is an acronym for the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, a Zionist, very clear Zionist group who decided to redefine what it means, what anti-Semitism means. And that definition includes basically criticism of Israel. And I'm generalizing, I won't get into the exact definition, but you can find it online if you go to IHRA definition. So being anti-Semitic is no longer, according to them, just being racist and targeting Jewish people, but it includes all these other things. And they've been very successful in getting the Labour Party, other political, basically governmental and non-governmental organizations, boards of universities here in the United States and the different states, to accept this new definition of anti-Semitism. And then it includes, well, people like certainly the four of us who dare to say certain things about the state of Israel and reject Zionism perhaps and so forth. The other point I just want to make, you mentioned UK Jews and how they were saying that people like yourself and the Labour Party were presenting an existential threat. There are only about 260,000 Jews in the UK. And from research that I've done, about 50 to 60,000 of those Jews are part of the ultra-Orthodox community, and they reject Zionism and the state of Israel altogether. Like one rabbi said to me, you drive around Stamford Hill, I'll give you 100 pounds for any Israeli flag you find. So I just wanted to throw that in there for the listeners to give some context. But you were beat up pretty badly for saying that Labour has been apologizing too much, even though you're absolutely right.
Yeah. Look, my position is, I've fought racism all my life. I left school as a young man at 15 years of age. I didn't go to university. I went to Polytechnic in later life. I worked on a building site. And casual racism in the 1970s was endemic, really. And I was an active member of the Anti-Nazi League and regularly confronted anti-Semites, bigots, racists on the street and on building sites, and nearly got beaten up on more than a few occasions. And so it was particularly hurtful then to be accused of being effectively being a bigot, a racist, when I've spent my whole life fighting racism in all its forms. And look, and you're absolutely right with the IHRA. It was most certainly pressure brought to bear for the Labour Party to adopt the IHRA examples, precisely because it brought into the definition of anti-Semitism criticism of Israel. And I prefer the Oxford Dictionary definition of anti-Semitism, which is very, very clear, which talks about hatred of Jewish people. And it's a very simple one-sentence explanation, and everybody can understand that. Whereas the IHRA, I think it runs to about 500 odd words, and it's all about ensuring that criticism of Israel is caught in that definition, which then gave the ability to the opponents of pro-Palestinians inside the Labour Party, most notably, of course, Jeremy Corbyn, to then take action against Jeremy's allies, against the socialists in the Labour Party, who were universally pro-Palestinian and opposed to the apartheid state of Israel. And of course this gave them license to do that. They were already making the accusations about anti-Semitism even before I got re-elected to Parliament, because I was in Parliament from 2010 to 2015 and then lost my seat by a very narrow margin. And then when Jeremy got his name onto the ballot paper, I was a very high profile supporter of his, and very quickly after that I started getting accusations about anti-Semitism, obviously, as did Jeremy and many, many others. But it was difficult for the pro-Zionists, predominantly the right wing in the Labour Party, to take action against individuals until such time as the IHRA examples were brought in as part of the Labour Party rulebook. And this was yet another concession. And the other interesting thing, if I could just say, Miko, is that some of the people who have been singled out for the most virulent attacks are socialist, anti-racist, anti-Zionist Jewish members of the Labour Party, most notably people like Jackie Walker, who a film was made about her experience and indeed the wider attacks on anti-Zionist Jews inside the Labour Party. It's a film called Witch Hunt, which if anybody watching is interested, I would highly recommend that they view it, because it really sets out these tactics and how anti-Zionist Jews in particular have been targeted. But it's so grotesque. Jackie Walker, a black Jewish woman, expelled from the Labour Party, accused of anti-Semitism. Cyril Chilson, long-standing member of the Labour Party, who was born in Israel, served in the Israeli Defence Force. His wife, born in Israel, served in the Israeli Defence Force. Very strong pro-Palestinian, lived in the UK now for some time. Cyril's parents survived Auschwitz. He was accused of anti-Semitism and he was expelled from the Labour Party. Tony Greenstein, the son of a rabbi whose father stood up to Oswald Mosley's fascists at the Battle of Cable Street, was accused of anti-Semitism, and he's been expelled from the party. And so the list goes on. It's so grotesque, it's so despicable. And, I felt very passionately about it. And I felt it was my obligation as a socialist to speak out for people who had been falsely accused, particularly, I don't know, I just found it particularly offensive that long-standing Jewish members of the party had been accused of anti-Semitism. It just didn't seem to compute or make any sense to me whatsoever. And I felt it was so important, therefore, that we had to stand to it. But it illustrates the power that the lobby has, because not one other Labour MP, even the MPs who sit in the so-called socialist campaign group of Labour MPs, felt able to speak out in my defence or indeed in anybody else's defence. So there's been many other high-profile people who have been accused falsely and then subsequently expelled, and not a single member of the socialist campaign group of Labour MPs has spoken out. And what's very interesting is that some of the Muslim MPs, Zara Sultana being one of the most notable amongst them, has been singled out for attack. And it is Islamophobic attacks which have been levelled against her by the pro-Zionists. And, she's been made to issue a grovelling apology for some of the statements that she's made, which absolutely, don't merit an apology in any way, shape or form. But what's happened, of course, is that, we're perhaps getting into the sort of next question really in terms of tactics and so on, is that the organisation of the left that was established, Momentum, to try and maintain the momentum of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership election victory in 2015, was led by John Landsman, who himself is a Zionist. And, they then took on the whole witch hunt against pro-Palestinian activists in the Labour Party. And the Jewish Voice for Labour was dismissed by John Landsman, with words to the effect, well, they're not really part of the Jewish community. I mean, it's a sort of delegitimizing people in that way. It illustrates really, the depths to which they will plumb in order to pursue their goal. And obviously their goal was to dismantle the Corbyn project and then utterly destroy it. And that's what they've achieved. Now we have somebody in the form of Keir Starmer, who says he, is Zionist, supports Zionism, but indeed all of the three candidates who were standing for the Labour leadership utterly capitulated to the Board of Deputies with the 10 pledges that they were expected to make, which included things like suspending or expelling anybody who had the temerity to speak on a platform with or speak in supported terms about anybody else who's been suspended or expelled for allegations of anti-Semitism being made against them. It's just, you know, it's an incredible state of affairs that the Labour Party's got itself into now, and I frankly can't see what means they have now of extricating themselves from it. It's a very worrying state of affairs for the long-term future of the Labour Party. It certainly is the long-term future of the Labour Party as a progressive force in Britain.
Well, it seems that a lot of this is guilt by association. Both the accusations that were leveled against you, which are absurd, some of which have to do with guilt by association. You either stood by someone, or you spoke for someone, or you know, which is really quite absurd, which is why the term witch hunt is so appropriate. I had a small experience last year in Liverpool, the year before that, I should say. We saw Jeremy on the street and took a picture with him, and I was wearing this button, the BDS button, and I asked him if it was okay to take a picture and post it with this button, and he agreed. He said it was okay. And that afternoon, the Daily Mirror, I believe, posted the picture and said, "Look, Jeremy Corbyn with the known anti-Semite, Holocaust denier Miko Peled." You know, I mean, how absurd can you? I mean, it's really quite absurd. And what you said about Jewish Voice for Labor, which is, you know, all the events that I've been to in the last 2 years that they've held, including, I believe, one where you spoke, were packed. I mean, we're talking about a huge number of people that are associated with that group who oppose this witch hunt and who oppose this lack of freedom of speech on Israel. Ali, I want to turn to you, and you've written a lot, you've been involved a lot on this issue, you've researched a lot. Of course, you're the one who, or at least Electronic Intifada, put out the support documentary that and maybe you could talk about that as well. But you know, go ahead and tell us what you know, what your thoughts are on this issue, on this question.
Well, thank you, Miko, and thank you, Jamil, for bringing us together. It's an effort to do this and to bring us out of our isolation. So I really appreciate that, and it's wonderful to be on the panel with Chris and with Dr. Wilmer. And listening to Chris, it's of course, you know, just absolutely devastating what the Israel lobby has done to him, done to so many other people who are lifelong anti-racists, just like Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, the perversity of taking someone like Jeremy Corbyn, who was really on the front lines, getting arrested, protesting against apartheid in South Africa, a lifelong opponent of anti-Semitism and racism, while the people who are in power in the UK, who are now accusing him of anti-Semitism, you know, the leaders of the Conservative Party, those thugs supported apartheid in South Africa, supported Thatcher when she opposed sanctions on South Africa, and that they have frankly the chutzpah to accuse someone like Jeremy Corbyn, or like Chris, or like Jackie Walker, or Tony Greenstein, and so many other lifelong anti-racist activists of anti-Semitism, shows the utter perversity of this campaign. But what I want to do is really step back and give some background to this, because your initial question was, what's the evidence we have? You know, is this just all, you know, just stuff that's happening? And of course it isn't. This is very much part of a strategy that has come from Israel, and it's not some kind of conspiracy theory. All you have to do is read the documents and reports that come from Israel and its various think tanks and its Ministry of Strategic Affairs and so on. And I think, at least in recent history, a key document was published 10 years ago, in 2010, by an outfit called the Re'ut Institute. It's an Israeli think tank with very close ties to the Israeli government and the Israeli intelligence apparatus. And this report, the Re'ut report as it came to be known, was really set the agenda for Israel and its lobby over the past 10 years. And the basic observation of this report was that the main threat to Israel was no longer military. It wasn't going to be columns of tanks crossing Israel's borders. And therefore, a military response was no longer the way Israel was going to survive over the long term. Just the same way apartheid South Africa was never defeated militarily. The apartheid army in South Africa always had the warplanes and the tanks and the cannons and everything, by the way, mostly supplied by Israel, but that's a topic for another day. But it was defeated morally, it was defeated politically, it was defeated internationally. So tanks and warplanes couldn't allow apartheid South Africa to survive. They were not enough. And so the Reut Institute said, if Israel only relies on military tactics, it risks going the way of apartheid South Africa or East Germany. And so you have to see, what is the real threat to Israel in the 21st century? It's political, it's cultural. It's that Israel is more and more being seen in the same light as apartheid South Africa. And the erosion of support is most visible on the left among progressives. You have to remember that in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, Israel was seen wrongly, but widely as a sort of a socialist experiment with kibbutzes. The fact that the kibbutzes were, built on ethnically cleansed Palestinian villages was overlooked. You had all these even Bernie Sanders boasts about how he went to a kibbutz at one point, and various European political leaders went to kibbutzes in their youth and have this nostalgic idea of Israel as this sort of socialist or social democratic paradise. But certainly after the first Intifada in the late 1980s, that started to erode dramatically. And that accelerated in the 1990s as Israel shifted more and more to the open far right, no more with this sort of social democratic seasoning on top, an openly racist state. So the loss of support on the left accelerated, and we've seen Israel has become more and more a right-wing, an extreme right-wing cause. You see that in the phenomenon of, in the United States, people hanging Confederate flags and Israeli flags together, or Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil marching under an Israeli flag just the other day. Israel is now the model for right-wing extremists and even right-wing anti-Semites like Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister in Hungary, and so on. So the Reut Institute saw this in 2010 and they said, look, we have to stem the loss of support for Israel, particularly on the left. And they identified two parallel strategies. One is to try to split the left, to sort of divide it into what they called the soft critics of Israel, the people who, they're a little bit hand-wringy about, oh, well, Israel shouldn't build settlements, and we're worried about a two-state solution, and Israel should be a little bit nicer. And the people who really have a fundamental critique of Zionism as a racist ideology that promotes the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians so that settler colonists can take their place, and particularly the BDS movement. And so the good critics of Israel, the soft critics, and the bad critics who fundamentally reject Zionism and support BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. So what do? You have to go after the so-called delegitimizers, the bad critics, punish them, smear them, attack them, isolate them, exclude them. This is all in the Reut Institute report. This was said in the open. They talk about sabotage and attack. Those are the words that the Reut Institute used at the time. And on the other side, what do you do about the soft critics? Is you have to sort of seduce them. And this involves a major international brand Israel campaign to market Israel as this sort of progressive paradise for the 21st century. So it's no longer about grim social democratic, socialist kibbutzes and, people working on the land, because, millennials aren't interested in going to work on farms in Israel. So you have to sell Israel for the 21st century. So how do you do that? You sell it as gay friendly, mostly a bogus narrative, by the way. But pink washing. So you claim that Israel is this LGBTQ haven in a region where, supposedly people who engage in same-sex sex are being thrown off buildings. Greenwashing, marketing Israel falsely again as this, source of environmental technologies and green energy and so on, when in fact Israel was one of the worst emitters per capita of greenhouse gases in the region, as well as destroying the environment in the occupied West Bank, using the occupied West Bank, which Israel claims as its holy land, using it as a garbage dump, literally, setting up illegal garbage dumps next to Palestinian communities while the settlements pour raw sewage into Palestinian water sources. So greenwashing, a false narrative that Israel is this, environmental haven. And of course, marketing Israel using sex, Tel Aviv beaches, and, Israeli soldiers doing cute little dances on social media. And also the Eurovision Song Contest is a recent example of pinkwashing Israel and trying to make it cool. So these twin strategies we see ongoing from before 2010, but particularly after 2010. And then I'll mention just one other key moment, which was 2014, the last major attack on Gaza, when Israel murdered 1 in 1,000 Gaza residents. 1 in every 1,000 Gaza residents was killed by Israel over 51 days in the summer of 2014, including 550 children. That's an average of 11 children a day. And it was done with weapons supplied by the Obama administration at the time, supplied by the European Union and others. And that moment dramatically eroded, wiped out whatever gains the Reut Institute thought Israel had made. And in particular, it was a moment of sort of open solidarity between Palestinians and Black Americans in the United States organizing around the police murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson and the protests in Ferguson. And after that, we see the Reut Institute and other Israeli strategic think tanks openly fretting about the identification of the Ferguson and Black Lives Matter movement with the struggle for Palestinian rights. And after that, we see the Israel lobby going after the Black Lives Matter movement. That shows up in the US-Israel lobby film. Explicitly, Israel lobby operatives going to venues and pressuring them to cancel Black Lives Matter events to punish this movement and silence it, for many prominent members expressing solidarity with Palestine. So that, and of course you see, and Chris can talk about that, a similar pattern in the UK as well. Now I'll just end these comments with mentioning the Al Jazeera documentaries, because there were two. There was one called The Lobby, which focused on the UK and which shows the efforts to fabricate a fake pro-Israel grassroots movement within the Labour Party. This documentary reveals incontrovertibly direct Israeli government meddling in the Labour Party. Nobody has been able to refute it because it's all there on the screen. It shows prominent Labour MPs like Joan Ryan, who is the head of Labour Friends of Israel, fabricating accusations of anti-Semitism against an ordinary rank and file member of the Labour Party because she had the temerity to question Labour Friends of Israel's silence about Israel's settlement policies. that documentary was broadcast by Al Jazeera, and you can see it online. If you just search for Al Jazeera, the lobby UK, it was broadcast. You can see it online. I strongly recommend it to everyone. There was a second documentary which focused on the lobby in the US, another brilliant piece of work done by a really fantastic journalist at the Al Jazeera Investigations Unit, which is sort of a special unit within Al Jazeera, and reveals similar meddling by the Israel lobby in the US. And that documentary was suppressed. And it was suppressed after Qatar and Al Jazeera came under intense pressure from this very same Israel lobby. And that's the one that the Electronic Intifada was able to get hold of and put online. And so if you search for the Lobby USA, you can, or just watch the film The Israel Lobby Didn't Want You to See. Search for that, it will come up, and perhaps someone will post it in the comments here. And that was the one that we were able to get a leaked copy of, and it's also essential viewing. What is remarkable about both of these films is that they were just ignored. The UK film got a little bit more attention. Boris Johnson, who was then the UK foreign minister, was required to sort of address it in Parliament, and they did brush it under the carpet. The Israeli spy, I mean, that's what he was, Shai Massad, who was working out of the Israeli embassy, was bundled off back to Israel, and the whole thing was brushed under the carpet. But the US film was just ignored by the mainstream media and by Democratic Party elites and so on. They just pretended it never happened. And you just have to imagine, I said this many times, you just have to imagine if it had been, say, about supposed Russian meddling. It would have been this massive global story. There would have been congressional hearings and so on. But it's a film that documented Israeli meddling in American politics. It documented US-based Israel lobby organizations working as agents of the Israeli government to spy on and sabotage Americans exercising their First Amendment rights, and doing so without being registered as foreign agents of a government. Groups like the Israel on Campus Coalition, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and the Israel Project, among others, their activities are really laid bare in this film.
Yeah, you know, it seems like the narrative is the most important thing right now. It's like you said, Ali, it's not about columns of tanks and warplanes attacking the small state of Israel, which used to be the narrative. Today, probably the Ministry of Strategic Affairs in Israel is the place where this is like the Situation Room, if you will, where all of this is being discussed, where all of this this war is actually being fought. And the Zionist narrative, which is really quite absurd, which says that Jewish people who mostly have not lived in Palestine over the last 2,000 years have a right to be there at the expense of Palestinians who actually lived there for the last 2,000 years. And then portraying Palestinians as terrorists and haters, and anybody who supports them as anti-Semitic. That's really, in a nutshell, this narrative. And they know that if you start chipping away at it, it's all going to hell, because it's a narrative that's built on one lie after the other. But that is the Holy Grail. They have to protect it. That's why it was obvious, I think, from the very beginning, at least to me and probably others, that there's no way they would allow Jeremy Corbyn to become prime minister. There's no way they would allow someone like Chris Williamson to continue a career in politics. They would do everything they can to stop Sanders, although perhaps, like you said, Sanders was far more Zionist. And they start very low. They don't start in Washington, D.C. You see them working, or at least I see them working here in the U.S., on the level of city council elections, people who run for city council, people who run for a state legislature and so forth, very, very local politics. that they're already there pushing and lobbying and applying pressure. And Wilmer, you and I have talked about this a lot on your show, and I'd love to hear your take on this issue. So why don't you go ahead?
Well, thank you, Miko, for the invitation and the opportunity to participate in this very, very important discussion with you, Ali and Chris. I thought I would provide a slightly broader historical context as the answer to the question. People have a tendency to deny that this is real because they don't connect the dots, and they don't see, or they tend to look at these issues and events as happening in a vacuum. So what evidence do we have that demonstrates the targeting of US and UK progressives? The answer can be, I think, fairly complex depending on how far back, particularly in the United States, you want to go. We have a history that is replete with evidence demonstrating the targeting of US and UK progressives. In 1968, what was called the Ocean Hill and Brownsville Parents Group versus the Teachers Union in New York City. There was a strike in 1968. The JDL, what then at that time was described as a newly formed Jewish paramilitary organization, they created this campaign of fear. The Teachers Union, working through the head of the Teachers Union, Al Shanker, claimed that the lives of Jewish teachers in the school district had been threatened by this African American organization that wanted to take control of schools in its district. And they claimed that if the community control was allowed to exist, that the black governing boards of the school system, they would fire all the Jewish teachers and replace them with black teachers, and that Jews in New York just would not be safe. And from that was created this myth of black anti-Semitism. And when you look at the history and when you look at what was actually being fought for, it wasn't anti-Jewish, it was anti-miseducation. But that's how the community control of schools was characterized by the JDL to protect what it saw as the interest of Jewish teachers in predominantly black schools. In terms of more fairly recent history, in 1975, you had President Gerald Ford was angry that Israel had refused to leave the Sinai after the 1973 war, and Ford suspended aid to Israel for 6 months. And he made a speech that, according to Jeffrey Blankford in the Israel Lobby on the Left, was supported by Henry Kissinger. And it called for a reassessment of the U.S.-Israeli relationship. Well, within weeks of Gerald Ford giving that speech, AIPAC had a letter signed by 76 senators expressing their support for Israel. And with that, Gerald Ford backed down. In 1982, we know about Congressman Paul Finley. He had served, I think, 22 years in the House of Representatives, and he went down in defeat after he crossed the political Maginot line and took a meeting or had a meeting with Chairman Yasser Arafat. And the pro-Israeli lobby in Washington saw to it that Paul Finley was not returned to Congress. In 1988, you have a AIPAC internal staff memo urging Jewish supporters to raise questions about Reverend Jesse Jackson threatening his presidential campaign. They were trying to dig up dirt on his sex life and his finances. The memo was entitled News Suggestions for Reporters, and they were, again, trying to dig up as much dirt as they could on Reverend Jackson, primarily because of his support for Palestinians, his support for other Middle East causes that were perceived to be contrary to the interests of Israel. They were looking for, as they said in the memo, seeds of information to plant. The memo said, quote, "We have more than enough articles on Jackson unless you can find someone willing to spill the beans on his extramarital affairs and finances of Operation Push." You get to 2002 with former Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney. She became a target of the Jewish lobby because she did not support the Sharon government. And she opposed the atrocities that were being committed by it against the Palestinians. Simply put, as Yuri Avernay wrote in Manufacturing Anti-Semites, quote, "The Jewish establishment found a counter candidate who was Denise Majette, a practically unknown Black woman, injected huge sums of money into the campaign, because at that time Georgia, and I think still does, had open primaries, and they defeated Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney. Avernay continued, all of this happened in the open with fanfares to make a public example so that every senator and congressperson would know that criticizing Sharon is tantamount to political suicide." Then we get more current with Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, and she was attacked by AIPAC and the ADL, and she was objecting to political pressure that was being put on her from Democrats and Republicans. They wanted everybody to express loyalty to Israel. And she said, quote, "I should not be expected to have allegiance or pledge support to a foreign country in order to serve my country in Congress." She continued, "I have not said anything about the loyalty of others, but spoke about the loyalty expected of me." And that was at the time when Republicans in Congress had introduced the Strengthening America's Security in the Middle East Act of 2019, which endorsed legislation adopted in more than 24 states in this country that were denying contracts to or barring state investments and employment with American individuals or groups who supported boycotts of Israel or who refused to sign oaths affirming that they would not boycott Israel. And then most recently, as you all have been talking about so clearly, what happened to Jeremy Corbyn, the British member of Parliament. So I won't reiterate that, but except to say, I see the attacks on Corbyn as a cover, these ad hominem attacks for his positions on promising to tax privatized utilities and rail companies back into public ownership, tax multinational companies like Google and Amazon. He promised to stop arms sales to Israel and Saudi Arabia, colonial history. He's fighting poverty and talking about ending continued support for repressive regimes across the globe, such as the Zionist government in Israel. So my only point there is, as I look at it way from the outside, yes, the accusations of anti-Semitism are being hurled at him at breakneck speed, but I just think that there are other issues along with his challenging the support for Israel that are being that the anti-Semitism label is being used to counteract, and then that is also very similar to the attacks on Senator Bernie Sanders. And as Miko, as you mentioned at the top, Sanders and Corbyn have different worldviews, but they're both anti-Zionist. They are anti-racist. They are unapologetically operating on the left side of the political spectrum. And they clearly are challenging the established order and what conservatives see as their sources of power and privilege. And when Sanders came out and made his comments about Israel being racist and being an apartheid regime, and his refusal to speak before AIPAC, he wrote that I remain concerned about the platform AIPAC provides for leaders who express bigotry and oppose basic Palestinian rights. For that reason, I will not attend the AIPAC conference. You had in this country a cross-section of Jewish community leaders, including prominent rabbis from all branches of American Judaism, that quickly put together an open letter, and they circulated. They had, I think, almost 350 signatures rejecting what they claimed to be Sanders' outrageous comments, and they were praising AIPAC's bipartisanship as, quote, one of the last remaining vehicles in American politics that proactively seeks to bring Americans from across the political spectrum to achieve a common goal. But they never articulate what that common goal is, which I think is one of the major points of this conversation today. Among those signing that letter was a Rabbi Stanley Davids, Rabbi Emeritus of Temple, I'm not sure of the pronunciation, Emmanuel, in Dunwoody, Georgia. He was also president of the Association of Reformed Zionists of America. He, virtue of the people he chooses to gather around himself, and by virtue of the statements he's made regarding Israel, has very weak standing to criticize AIPAC. He describes himself as a lifelong Democrat and critical of what he called the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Quote, the far left Democrats have drunken the Kool-Aid of anti-Zionism as part of this worldview, and I really regret that. Then you had even Mike Pence speaking to AIPAC, and he accused Bernie Sanders of siding with Israel's enemies for supporting Palestinian rights. He said Bernie Sanders would be the most anti-Israel president in the history of the United States, as he excoriated Sanders over his criticism of the government, saying, in the days ahead, we must ensure the most pro-Israel president in the history of the United States must not be replaced by one who would be the most anti-Israel president in the history. That's why they needed 4 more years of Trump.
As I'm sure you've
also
heard,
Pence.
I'm sorry, as I'm sure you've heard, at the unveiling of the Trump peace plan, or so-called peace plan, Netanyahu crowned Trump with that distinction of being the most pro-Israel president, in the history and so forth. But I'm going to interrupt you here for just a second to move on to the next question, just for this time. You talked about the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and what is happening there, and what I want to do is I want to move on to the next 2 questions and maybe combine them just for the sake of allowing more time later for the Q&A. What tactics do we recognize that they employ, and how do we tackle this dangerous phenomenon? And again, Chris, I think you're almost a test case of the tactics that they were used. I remember you and I walking together in Brighton at the last labor conference, and you were telling me about how you were fighting, and felt like the court was coming down on your side. You were, again, new accusations were leveled against you, so there was no room to breathe, no room to even defend yourself. and of course these are all outrageous nonsense accusations, but there was a barrage of them. And I think also you speak to the next question, which is how we tackle this, because you formed basically a new movement, and you've got the Festival of Resistance, and you've got this whole resistance movement, and perhaps you can talk about that, because I think it's a great example. So let's combine the two questions of identifying the tactics and then how we move forward.
Yeah, no, indeed. Well, the tactics were relentless, and they didn't give you, as you say, a moment to really breathe. And obviously, I wasn't the only victim. It was anybody, frankly, who put their head above the parapet to support the Palestinian cause. And I think Wilma's point as well is interesting, because there was a coalition of forces between the neoliberals and the Zionists, and they're one and the same in many circumstances, but others, I've never heard them necessarily speak about the issue before, suddenly were very exercised about anti-Semitism, and this was true certainly of the right-wing media in this country. And they used tactics on social media. We know that they were trawling through social media posts to try and find anything that could be used or misrepresented in order to make an allegation against that individual to get them suspended. And there were hundreds, thousands of people, activists. I describe them as Jeremy's Praetorian Guard, who were being systematically thrown under the bus on an industrial scale. And it was right across the piece. You'd got the mainstream media on side. They were making these absurd accusations. Right-wing newspapers that day after day are demonizing refugees and asylum seekers to the country, suddenly having screaming headlines about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. And accusing somebody, a man of peace, a more gentle individual you could probably be difficult to find than Jeremy Corbyn, whose record stands any examination in relation to his position on fighting all forms of racism, including anti-Semitism. And yet he was being held up as this epitome of bigotry and anti-Semitism. And you'd got organizations like the Jewish Labour Movement, which we've mentioned previously, also Momentum, were colonized for this purpose, to join in the witch hunt and to accuse falsely people, including people like Jackie Walker, who indeed was the vice chair of Momentum. She's a black Jewish woman, married to a Jewish guy, was thrown under the bus. And it was absolutely because of her sort of anti-Zionist position, her opposition to a two-state solution. She believes in a one-state solution to the conflict in Palestine, Israel. And this was seen as beyond the pale. You've got the chief rabbi in Britain speaking out at the height of the general election, attacking the Labour Party, attacking the leader of the party, and essentially urging people not to support the Labour Party in the general election in that way. You've got senior politicians who were members of the Labour Friends of Israel, people like Margaret Hodge, who were drawing an equivalence between the horrors of the Holocaust and receiving a letter from the Labour Party reminding her of her obligations as an MP. This is after she'd said in the chamber of the House of Commons, albeit behind the Speaker's chair, in front of Tory MPs who were exiting the chamber at the time, and Jeremy Corbyn was leading the chamber at that time, and she accused him, if you excuse my language, this is what she accused him of, being a fucking anti-Semite and a racist. And she got a letter simply saying that isn't really the appropriate behaviour of an MP, and you need to essentially mind your P's and Q's. But other people who said the most modest of things have been suspended and expelled from the Labour Party, and so this was a sort of tactics which were being deployed. And you have to remember as well that the Parliamentary Labour Party, around 50% or more, are members of Labour Friends of Israel, and they were ruthless, frankly, in their attacks, secret cabals of just to work out how they could mount the next attack on Jeremy. I mean, there was the coup, and then there was the attack on me. And when I was reinstated to the party, because I was suspended unfairly in the first instance, and then it went through a process in the party, and a panel considered the arguments, considered my representations, and reinstated me to the party. That led to a massive furore in the media, led by people like Tom Watson, who was the deputy leader of the party and a prominent member of Labour Friends of Israel. And a letter was signed by, I think, over 100 Labour MPs and peers to go to the next meeting of the Parliamentary Labour Party, calling for the whip to be withdrawn from me for a year and for an investigation to be mounted into how it happened that I ended up being reinstated into the Labour Party. That then frightened the horses. It spooked the bureaucracy, which is utterly broken and completely sort of compliant with the sort of Zionist lobby and doing their bidding essentially. They backed down, and after 2 days I was resuspended, and I then took High Court action, and successfully actually. The Labour Party bureaucracy tried on 3 occasions to get the hearing delayed. We were calling for an expedited hearing. And when at the third preliminary hearing, the judge specified a particular week in which the hearing would have to be held or heard, they then realised that they were going to have to go to court, and I think they recognised they've got a very flimsy case. And so I was then hit with a third suspension. I mean, and the accusations which merited the suspension were so absurd. One of them was because I'd given an interview to Sky TV in Britain where I had chided Margaret Hodge for drawing an equivalence between the Holocaust and receiving a letter from the Labour Party. And I received an offensive, obscene email from a Conservative supporter taking me to task for that and saying how much she supported Margaret Hodge. And I responded very politely saying, "Dear Claire, thank you for your email. You might like to view this video," and gave her a link to a video of Norman Finkelstein, an acclaimed Jewish academic who was addressing Margaret Hodge directly and basically taking her to task for drawing that equivalence and pointing out that he'd lost relatives in the Shoah, and was an offensive to him that she was behaving in that way, and that was held up as a justification, or one of the justifications for resuspending me. And another justification was because I told people at that conference that you mentioned, Miko, where we spoke, that I was going to be attending the conference, speaking at various fringe meetings, and a number of the supporters of the Labour Friends of Israel and others on the right of the party had, particularly people like Ruth Smith, had were very critical about the fact that I was going to be in the environs of the Labour Party conference and saying I shouldn't be anywhere near. And so the media came on to me for a comment, and I merely said, these characters need to pipe down and focus on exposing the Conservatives, getting behind the leader of the Labour Party and fighting for a Labour victory at the election. That was given as another reason to suspend me. And the implication was there was some anti-Semitic overtone to my comment that they should pipe down. And so this is the level to which they have sunk. And I think the mistake has been where the movement has made a huge error, in my opinion, in actually allowing this to gain momentum. It comes back to the advice I was giving to Jeremy in not actually standing up to it. We absolutely, it seems to me, have to confront this head on and make the point. And I think many people don't really get this, but I think we have to argue unambiguously that Zionism is inconsistent with socialism. I mean, I know the Jewish Labour movement have this thing called Zionist socialism. I mean, the two are a contradiction in terms, in my opinion.
It's like Zionist socialism is like racist social. I mean,
yeah,
you know, or it's like talking about racist anti-racism or anti-racist racism. It's a completely nonsensical construction. But that requires us to have a discussion about what Zionism is.
Yes.
Zionism isn't some mushy, you know, what they're trying to, what the groups like the Jewish Labor movement and Zionist groups here in the United States are trying to do is convert Zionism into some sort of personal identity thing.
Yeah.
So if you say, I'm a Zionist, and then I say to you, well, Zionism is racism, it's like, oh my God, you attacked me, you hurt my feelings, you made me feel unsafe. And that's what they've converted it into. And that's what people in the UK in particular have gotten completely caught up in. And
oh, very much so, very much so. I mean,
lost sight of what Zionism is. Zionism is the belief that Palestinians can and must be expelled from their homeland so that settlers can take their place. Zionism is the belief that Palestinian refugees cannot return to their homeland, to the towns and villages from which they were expelled solely and exclusively because they're not Jewish, okay? I don't care how that makes you feel. That's the reality.
Absolutely.
Right. So what I'm saying is it requires us to be willing to have that discussion, to explain what Zionism means, not to Ruth Smith or not to Joan Ryan, but what it means to Palestinians thrown off their land, expelled, their homes demolished, their children killed because they're not Jewish. That's what Zionism is. And if that makes you feel bad, or it makes you feel like, you know, I've hurt your feelings, tough luck. Tough luck.
With you. I mean, what I was going to go on, Sally, is absolutely, and you articulated it far better than I could. But absolutely, I think what we have to do is articulate the fact that Zionism is a racist ideology. And I think the other mistake that the soft left, if you like, made on this was really what you've just set out there, and failing to recognize the international dimensions to this. You know, this isn't something that's kind of, you know, as we know, unique to Britain. This is something which is happening all over the world, where progressive politicians are being demonized and being attacked in order to, you know, protect their interests. And of course, you know, some of these so-called, you know, left commentators don't seem to have, in my experience anyway, I'm not seeing much evidence of them identifying the inconsistencies as well, because you have a situation where, you know, Netanyahu is cozying up to Viktor Orban, you know. I mean, a more anti-Semitic political leader, it would be hard to come across. But of course, he's, you know, he supports the existence of Israel, and so he's seen as a, you know, sort of a pro-Zionist, and so he's seen as okay. But in terms of his kind of attitude to Jewish people in his own country, you know, that seems to be, there's a veil over that. And I think it's really important that we identify those inconsistencies in their positioning, and indeed, as you quite rightly point out there, Ali, the fact that you know, this is very much a racist ideology. You know, for Zionism to flourish, it is at the expense of the Palestinian people. It's an absolute outrage and can't be allowed to stand, and is absolutely inconsistent with socialism. You know, I know. And everybody watching it isn't necessarily socialists. I don't know if even all the panels are. But for people who claim to be, certainly in the, you know, on the left of politics in Britain, socialist, you can't be a socialist and sympathetic to Zionism at the same time. As you say, it's like being a racist socialist. It's just the two things don't compute. It's an oxymoron. It's a contradiction in terms.
There's been I see it as there's been a very powerful myth that has been created that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are synonymous. And it's a very powerful tool stifling any type of constructive dialogue, the presentation of the facts, valid policy analysis. Because to be able to control the dialogue by controlling the definition of the terminology, that is incredibly powerful. I equate that to what's been happening in this country with the Republicans and their pollster Frank Luntz, who has his word labs, and he's convinced the Republicans that the Pentagon should be called the Department of Defense, that tax relief is better terminology than tax cuts. They have been able to convince voters to vote against their best interest by controlling the terminology. And that, to me, is one of the very important things that that has to be done here is those who are in sync with our thinking have to reclaim the terminology, because it's having a huge effect here. In my laying out the timeline that I did, what happens is, by using that terminology, they are able to separate African Americans and Palestinians, because to support Palestinians makes you anti-Semitic, and nobody in this country wants to be labeled as such. And that becomes a very, very powerful wedge in developing any type of allegiances, alliances, or friendships between groups that have very similar interests.
You know, I want to interject here. Go ahead, Ali.
Yeah, I just want to say, because your question also talked about tactics, their tactics and our response. And I think, I just want to reinforce what Chris said. And I think that this is really a problem on the left generally, which is appeasement doesn't work. You know, the example I like to give is, a few years ago, the European Union came up with this very timid policy, which they don't even enforce, that goods from Israeli settlements should be labeled as coming from settlements. It wasn't that goods should be banned coming from settlements, it's just that they should have a label on them. It was the most minimal policy, and they spent 100 years discussing it, and then they passed the policy and they still don't enforce it properly. But and all of this timidity was to avoid upsetting Israel, to do the very minimum. Israeli ministers referred to the European Union heads as Nazis. They said, what you're doing is the same as the Nazis did, calling for a boycott of Jewish businesses. So what that demonstrates is that if you take the most minimal stance, if you say, oh, well, Israel, maybe you shouldn't build settlements because it might harm, you know, it's unhelpful to a two-state solution, they're going to call you a Nazi anyway. So don't appease them. Tell the truth. Be clear. Be principled. We, of course, as anti-racists, as Palestinians, as people who believe in humanity, we fight anti-Semites the way we fight other racists. But when people accuse us of anti-Semitism for defending our rights, defending human rights, defending universal values, we don't back down to them. We don't appease them. Appeasement doesn't work. And the disaster of what happened to Jeremy Corbyn is largely, as Chris said, because of appeasement. That appeasement policy,
you know, I was just
if Corbyn had stood up and rallied his supporters and said, I don't have to apologize to anyone. I've been on the front lines fighting racism while, you know, all of these people were supporting apartheid in South Africa. And I challenge anyone to come and show evidence that I'm a racist or this movement is racist. He would have put it to bed. He would have stopped it in its tracks. But this constant, oh, well, we have to meet with these racists and we have to appease them and we have to sign on to their 10 points and we have to do this and we have, it's endless. All they will do is demand more and more. And we see this in the United States as well. So that's the one thing. The other point I just want to make very quickly is that why are they going after the Sanderses and the Corbyns and Chris Williamson and so on, is because our movement is making progress. The grassroots is with us. And this is very important. As we talk about the thuggish tactics that the Israel lobby engages in, it's important to understand that often that kind of thuggery and bullying and sabotage and smearing is a sign of weakness, because opinion is changing at the grassroots. So I think it's very important that we not be discouraged by these tactics and we not retreat, and we not retreat into a narrative that says, oh, the Israel lobby is all powerful. It is not all powerful. We can fight back. We are gaining ground. We are convincing people that the struggle for Palestinian rights is a struggle for universal human rights, and it's one that unites us with everybody who is fighting against racism and injustice in this world.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Ali, I thank you. That's brilliant. And you know, when we were discussing putting together this panel, you know, I've heard all three of you speak. Chris, I heard you speak. I think last time you were standing outside in the rain, and there were maybe 10 people there, and you just gave this riveting speech right off the cuff in Brighton. And so the beauty of, I think, what the three of you have brought here is being able to say what most people will take hours and hours, but to say it quickly and succinctly, and I appreciate that. So thank you for that. We've been going on for a little bit more than an hour, so it's probably a good idea to open it up to questions so that we don't take all day, although we could. And so let's see, Jamil, do you want to throw out those, you know, start presenting the questions? And I think the best thing to do is we'll hear a question and just freely go ahead and reply, you know, as you see fit.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so we've received several questions, and we're going to try and get through as many as we can. This first question is anonymous. Here's a question. Considering the strong and powerful influence of the Zionists in both the US and UK, do you feel that trying to work through the system of electoral politics as it's currently constructed will reap any rewards? Can anyone cite an example of a victory for the Palestinian cause that was achieved through electoral politics?
So is there any point in sticking to, in investing our efforts in electoral politics as you know, people who support Palestinian rights and progressive ideas? And maybe Chris, you want to start with that, because you're building.
Yeah, I mean, well, look, I think there's a major issue, and I've been calling into question the you know, the suitability of our democracy in reality. I mean, you know, we pride ourselves on what we refer to as representative democracy, but I've been posing the question in the last few months, who are the representatives actually representing? Because it's not really the British people in Britain's case. I mean, if they were, we wouldn't have, in the 5th biggest economy in the world, 14 million people living in poverty. But I think the key thing is really, you know, in terms of ensuring that we get politicians, you know, who are fit for purpose and are brave and are prepared to, you know, to stand up for what's right. I shouldn't be the odd one out. I shouldn't be an oddity. I mean, I was the only person that was prepared to put my head above the parapet and speak out for people who had been badly treated, who'd been falsely accused. And to me, it didn't feel it was any great sort of heroic action on my part. It just felt, you know, just second nature. It's something that you had to do. But I think where I think Jeremy was badly let down, I mean, well, one, I think in not actually trusting his own instincts, but I think in terms of the lack of support that came from, you know, close confidants and indeed some of these so-called, you know, progressive left commentators in the media, because they bought into the Zionist narrative. They bought into the witch hunt. And they, if you like, in a way, made it difficult for Jeremy. And I think this is where one of the key things is so important in terms of standing up to these bullies, to these thugs, to these criminals in reality, is solidarity. I mean, I always make the point, you know, solidarity is absolutely crucial. It's always important, but it only really counts when it's difficult, not just when it's easy. That's why I felt it was absolutely essential to stand up for these people who had been so badly treated. And I think what we therefore need is to recognize the strength of our own common endeavor and to, you know, demand and force the issue and to get behind anybody who is prepared to put the head above the parapet. And I think it was Ali that made the point, you know, we are making progress. We are making ground. And, you know, many, many, many thousands of people, grassroots members that is, came to my support when I was suspended from the Labour Party. So I think, you know, more and more people are prepared to stand up. And I think what's happened after the last election in the Labour Party, the new leader and the direction the party is taking now, and people can increasingly see the atrocities that are being perpetrated by the Israeli state, are increasingly prepared to stand up. And so I'm fairly hopeful that, you know, that we can make significant ground you know, we made ground, and I think, you know, things can happen very, very quickly, you know. And I think, you know, if we just recognize the strength of our common endeavor, you know, we can really, really start to motor and really make a big difference.
When you look at the civil rights movement in the United States, there was a three-pronged approach. There was the legislative approach, there was the judicial approach, and there was activism in the streets. They worked together. I think abandoning any one of those elements weakens, not strengthens, your efforts. And looking at it again here in the U.S., Rashida Tlaib was elected, Ilhan Omar was elected, AOC, and so the squad. Now we know we've got issues with the consistency of their votes and the consistency of their messaging. Some of that though comes from people just once they got elected, not keeping their hand on the till, not being sure that the people that they sent to office do what they were sent there to do. That's a part of the process. But I think and Bernie Sanders, to what Miko said early in the discussion, Bernie Sanders made tremendous progress in terms of furthering the issues on the left. So it's a marathon. It's not a sprint, not to sound trite, but you can't abandon any of those elements in the struggle because each of them contribute to the other.
Yeah, Ali, you've been you know, keeping them honest. You know, starting with Rashida and her J Street endorsement, and you know, certainly Bernie, you've been on his case, and now with Ilhan Omar and the Iran, you know, this new thing. But is there any point in working through electoral politics? What do you think?
I think it would be very easy to say no, and it would be very easy to point to the debacle of Bernie Sanders walking away at the very moment when he should have stayed and fought, and looking at the you know, the failure of the Jeremy Corbyn movement. I mean, it's hard to avoid that it failed, but I don't think, you know, and I think it would be easy to take a sort of a more radical than thou position and say electoral politics is just pointless. Clearly, it's not the solution by itself, and that's where I think Dr. Wilmer is quite right, that it has to be part of a strategy. Because look, to me, it's ultimately, it's not about Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn. And it's not about finding a leader who you put all your trust in. But what I look at is, what inspires me is not Bernie Sanders or not Jeremy Corbyn. What inspires me is the millions of people who put their energy and their hopes and their money into trying to change their countries in the world into a more peaceful and more economically just place. And so the problem is, when these electoral movements fail, then all that energy is potentially dissipated and lost, and people feel defeated and they feel like it was all for nothing. And so that's where our political systems are broken, and people are talking about the futility of working within the Democratic Party, the futility of working within the Labour Party. And I understand that after these recent experiences. The question is, how can we put that energy, whether it's into third parties or into extra parliamentary movements or into reviving trade union movements? I mean, for goodness sake, we need trade unions more than ever. When you look at the governments in our countries, particularly the United States, that is happy to send the lowest paid workers to be sacrificed to the coronavirus, so that big business bosses can continue to reap profits. It's just obscene. And so the absence of a strong labor movement makes people much more vulnerable. So we have to be talking about where to direct that energy so that it's not lost. And and the other thing I always say is that, you know, yes, Jeremy Corbyn, I hope nobody's going to care now, but I met him and he is a very nice guy. I think that would have been on the cover of the Daily Mail a few months ago or a few years ago, but I said I met him. But, you know, he seems like a lovely guy. Bernie Sanders, I disagree with him on many things, but he does also seem like someone you'd want to sit and have a cup of tea with. But that's not the point. Bernie Sanders is not running to be my uncle. Jeremy Corbyn is not running to be my best friend. Rashida Tlaib is not running to be my aunt. Okay? These people are politicians who want to wield power over us. And therefore, you have to be absolutely relentless in holding them accountable. We have to learn from the right on this. I say this all the time. The right never takes yes for an answer. When you give in to the demands of the right, they say, okay, well, that's a small down payment on what we want. Now here's the list of other things we demand from you. And I see this contrary tendency on the left of making excuses for politicians, of saying, well, oh, well, you know, Jeremy can't do that now because, well, you know, he's under attack, or this is as far as Bernie can go right now. Don't make excuses for them. Demand more. And when they give you what you want, demand even more. That's the only way we can move the political window to where we want it to go. You can't appease your way into power. You can't concede your way into power. You can't, apologize your way into power. You have to make clear demands and stick with them. And of course, politics involves negotiations, but you never go into a negotiation having conceded everything at the outset. And sadly, I see that there's too much of that on the left. We have to stand up for what we believe in.
I couldn't agree with you more on that, Alan. And that's one of the reasons why I've been now working with others to try to launch a new grassroots movement in Britain. Obviously, we've been stymied a little bit by the COVID-19 crisis and the lockdown, but we're very clear about what we want to do. First of all, we want to, yes, obviously focus on domestic social policy, but we want to also be unambiguously anti-imperialist as well. And we want to, your point really, about raising expectations. Look, as I've already mentioned, Britain is the fifth biggest economy in the world, and yet it ain't working in our interests. And we, as ordinary working class people in Britain, have far more in common with working class people around the world than we have with the elites that are pulling the strings, and neoliberals that have actually been manipulating the economy to benefit them at the expense of everybody else. So that's what we intend to do. And yes, it is extra parliamentary activity, and it's about trying to build capacity in communities. It's about, you know, trying to sort of do things for ourselves like the Black Panther Party did in the States. But it's also very much about, you know, raising political consciousness, raising expectations, and obviously, yes, continuing to work through the electoral system. And I think Wilma made the point, you know, all these things are needed, you know, the street protest, the kind of, you know, political consciousness raising, the electoral politics, all these things have to work together. One thing on its own ain't going to work. You know, extra parliamentary activity is not going to change the world, but it might on its own, but it might help to, you know, shape the opinions of the wider general public. It might help to bring pressure and shape the policy direction of politicians. And it also, what I'm hoping through this movement, that we will bring through new and inspire new working class leaders to come through and pick up the electoral cudgels, as it were, to, you know, to take you know, the message into the debating chambers of local authorities and ultimately the House of Commons, to ensure that we start to get legislation which is fit for purpose, you know, which does address, you know, the inequalities in society, which does address the climate crisis and stops these appalling bloody wars which are taking place, and the you know, the arms sales which seem to hold so much sway. You know, our politicians, it seems to me, are in hock on both sides of the Atlantic to the military-industrial complex, and we have to find a better way. And of course, Jeremy, you know, was disturbing that that status quo. And that's another reason why, of course, you know, he was attacked. And he was badly let down, as just to repeat that point, Miko, by, you know, key commentators who should have been on his side, claimed to be on his side, but they got sidetracked with this whole bogus anti-Semitism scandal and crisis. And that derailed us. And that absolutely derailed us. And, you know, the ultimate consequence of that has been to see the Corbyn project be utterly destroyed. And we've got to start to rebuild. And that's why and he did ask me to mention briefly what I was doing in relation to that movement, Miko, so apologies if I'm going off slightly off piece there, but that's why, you know, I feel it's so important that we do, you know, focus on that, or that's what I'm going to put my energies into anyway, with a view to, as I say, raising political consciousness, getting these street protests going, doing things for ourselves and trying to shape the political agenda that way.
All right, next question, Jamil.
Okay, the next question is from David H. Bernie Sanders wanted to make future aid to Israel conditional on Israel changing its policies towards the Palestinians and Palestine, as opposed to the present arrangement of giving Israel unconditional support while looking the other way as Israel breaks international laws and commits crimes against the Palestinians. If he had not made that part of his platform, do you think that he might have won the Democratic Party nomination, or at least still be in the race to become a nominee?
No.
Do you think his stance on Palestine, on Israel, was instrumental in his stepping down?
Particularly his wanting to condition you know, the $4 billion per year that we sent to Israel in military aid based on, you know, human rights violations.
I think he was actually the part of the problem for the Democratic Party establishment is that his views on Palestine, his criticism of Israel, was very popular with the party base. You know, he was winning primaries despite or even because of the fact that he was critical of Israel. So that's why we saw over the last year or two an internal lobby group called the Democratic Majority for Israel was established, basically one of these, you know, political action committees to try to shore up support for Israel within the Democratic Party. And Democratic Majority for Israel actually ran ads against Bernie Sanders in Iowa and in Nevada, I believe. And what was interesting about their attacks on Bernie Sanders is they didn't mention his positions on Israel because they feared that would backfire. If they actually put out an ad saying, look at Bernie Sanders, he's critical of Israel, that would probably have made him more popular with Democratic Party voters. So the Democratic Majority for Israel ads focused on, oh, he's too old, or he's, you know, America isn't ready for socialism, but didn't mention Israel, because that's the thing that is really scaring the Democratic Party establishment, is that primary voters are actually perfectly okay with criticism of Israel. It's the financiers and the people who make the big donations to the party and the establishment and the mainstream media who will not allow those positions to be aired.
Ali is right. There is a big difference between the establishment / elite of the Democratic Party, who are basically right there with the Republicans in most of their issues, and the base of the party, and that's what really has caused Bernie Sanders so much problem. Because if you think back to 2016, he wasn't articulating the same position against Israel as he was articulating in this race, and they still stood up against him because he, like Jeremy Corbyn, was, and I mentioned this in some of what I said earlier, some of the other issues that Bernie was talking about, college student loan debt, Medicare for all, the bigger structural issues, dealing with the military industrial complex. He was talking about redistribution of wealth, and that in this country is the third rail. You don't want to talk about that. You don't want to talk about reorganizing American geopolitical structure around the world. You don't want to talk about that. You don't want to talk about Venezuela. You don't want to talk about Brazil and Bolivia and what the United States is doing there. Those were the things that were causing so much heartburn to Nancy Pelosi and to Chuck Schumer and to those elites in the party. His position on Israel damn sure didn't help him, but again, look at what they did to him in 16, and he wasn't taking nearly the position then as it related to Israel as he's taking now.
Sounds like it was a coalition between the neoliberals and the Zionists again, in a similar sort of situation that I mentioned in the UK, that sort of did for Bernie.
So Ali, so just so I understand, are you saying that his position on Palestine or his position on Israel was not the reason for his demise, or was not part of the reason?
I think it's definitely part of the reason that the establishment was dead set against it. But I agree with Wilma that, you know, my friend Joseph Messad, the professor at Columbia, wrote a really nice article a few weeks ago, really examining Bernie Sanders' positions. And he's a very mild social democrat. Yeah. And his criticism of Israel really doesn't go very far. But it's only in American terms that it looks incredibly radical. And, you know, in 2014, which is not so long ago, during the Gulf War, Bernie was, you know, angrily shouting down constituents at the town hall meeting who were raising, you know, the fact that Israel was butchering Palestinian civilians. So just from 2014 to 2020, Sanders became much more vocally critical of Israel, not as far as I would like him to go, but certainly in American terms, he was much more forthright, much more willing to speak out against Israeli attacks on Gaza and so on. And that's not because Bernie, after 70 odd years, suddenly had an epiphany. It was because the grassroots demanded it. It's because you couldn't go to a town hall meeting of, you know, Democratic voters without someone raising the question of Palestinian rights. The grassroots pushed Bernie Sanders. So that's why I'm not ready to say, well, abandon party politics or abandon electoral politics, because it is about changing every part of society. And believe me, the growth of support for the BDS movement is a massive headache for Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi can't just decide what Democratic voters should think. So I think that it is important to keep pressure up in every venue we can. I certainly would never advocate that we put all our eggs in the electoral basket, because clearly that is not a winning strategy. But I agree with Wilma that we don't abandon any field of battle. And some people are more suited to some arenas than others. I mean, I think I would be terrible at being a Democratic Party activist. But I'll do the things I can do. And if there are other people who can do that work and do it in a way that is principled and firm about what they're demanding for, then I would encourage them to keep doing it.
All right, Jamil, do you want to add the next question?
Yeah. So the next question is from Cian. And the question is, the evangelical pastors are complicit in making Zionism popular. How does the panel think this should be challenged? Trump surrounds himself with these people.
They should be exposed as the frauds that they are, every day, every way, all the time. And particularly the Christian right in this country is anything but Christian, and they're wrong. They're not right. The hypocrisy in their positions just needs to constantly be highlighted. And this whole idea of the rapture and that's what supposedly religiously is what brings them together makes absolutely no sense. But we have to understand that the Republican and conservatives in this country have captured the Christian right for political reasons, very similar to the way that the Zionists have tried to capture Judaism for political reasons. And unfortunately, those inconsistencies and that hypocrisy does not get called out for what it is, because in many conversations and in many instances, as soon as you start to question someone's religion or religiosity or the basis of their belief system, all of a sudden that becomes a conversation that is offline. But they have to be called out for the frauds that they are.
And I just say as well, I mean, speaking, I know this is a US-based question more, but I think, I mean, I agree with what Wilma said there about exposing, but I think the other thing, and this is where I think it's such a tragedy that Bernie Sanders has stepped out of the presidential race, because like in the UK, the biggest cohort in the US in elections are the non-voters. And I think somebody like Bernie Sanders, or a politician of that ilk, who could inspire, you know, the people who kind of opted out of the democratic process, have opted out of politics, don't feel that it's kind of a representative or serves their interests in that sense, and very often it doesn't. Bringing them to the party in that sense, bringing them into the electoral process, I think you know, if we could inspire those people in that way, and I, you know, maybe I'm a dreamer, I don't know, but I do think honestly that is the best route to you know, get a sort of a progressive prospectus adopted in government, is by ensuring that you have a program which can, you know, reach beyond the usual suspect, the people that, you know, normally participate. And I think turnout in elections in the States is probably even lower than it is in the UK. So I think you're absolutely with Wilma's saying, but I think in addition to that, you know, you need a kind of a progressive program that's going to speak to people that the present sort of duopoly in both the UK and the States isn't actually doing.
So some of that, I think, is inherent in the two-party system versus the parliamentary system. In your system, there's much more representation. You have a lot more opportunity for people to get involved because you have more parties involved. Here, it's more of a binary option. And when you look at the politics of the Republicans and the Democrats, particularly now, I mean, you've got Nancy Pelosi supporting the move on Venezuela. You've got Elizabeth Warren supporting the move on Bolivia, and they're supposed to be Democrats.
Yeah,
So I think some of that, the lack of voting, the lack of participation, I think some of it has to do with your parliamentary system is much more inclusive than the two-party system here.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point is that just in terms of the binary choice, it's not really a binary choice, is it? Because you've got two sides of the same coin, and both sides of the Atlantic, really. And that's what I mean. I mean, this is where I think Bernie was offering something different, you know, within that sort of two-party system. As was Jeremy offering something different, and Jeremy got very close in 2017, and you know, without going into all the details of the sabotage that the party was subjected to, which has been exposed in the linked document. You know, as Miko pointed out at the beginning of the program, a few thousand votes across the country would have seen a Corbyn-led Labour government, and the course of history would have been very, very different. And I think it would have had consequences, implications, positive implications for the rest of the world had that eventuality come to pass.
And I think that would have been a fantastic result in 2017. And Corbyn came so close and did so much better than his own party bureaucracy wanted. As you mentioned, the leaks, the documents that came out that showed that the unelected bureaucrats in Labour headquarters were actually trying to sabotage the party's own electoral campaign, and they succeeded in sabotaging it in a very similar way to how the Democratic National Committee fixed the 2016 primary, fixed the 2020 primary. They tried to cancel the New York primary, and a federal judge just ordered them to reinstate it. But the point is that, you know, let's imagine an alternative timeline where we don't live in this absolute nightmare we're in now. And, you know, where Jeremy Corbyn had won or Bernie Sanders had won. We have to be realistic that absolutely the same forces would have fought them every step of the way. We all know that. But that underscores the point about how, you know, even if you did win an election, as we've seen time and again, that only gets you so far without a strong, progressive, principled movements, trade unions, and extra parliamentary organizations to hold them accountable. And I think that is the inevitable lesson of the Sanders and Corbyn defeats. And I think, just to bring it back to our main topic, is that what we've seen, whether we also have to know what our strengths are. So if we come back to the issue of Palestine, the Palestine solidarity movement is strong at the grassroots. It has wide support. It has deep support. I feel that when I travel around the United States or around the world, something, who knows when we'll be able to do that again, but you feel it. You see it on campuses, in churches, all around the place. It's very deeply felt. What the Israel and its lobby have found is they do not have deep and wide support. They have a small core of fanatical support, and they also have a lot of friends in high places. And that's been their strategy. It's in the Re'ut document that I mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, that Israel has to capitalize on its strengths of cultivating, again, that's the language used by the Re'ut Institute, cultivating leaders and influencers, and that also underlines Israel's strategy of bringing up-and-coming political leaders and bloggers and artists and so on these all-expenses-paid junkets to Israel. That's a recognition that Israel doesn't have a lot of grassroots support. So what you have to do is sort of cultivate support among, more influential audiences, among media elites, and so on. And people like, let's name names, people like Owen Jones, the Guardian columnist, who, was very much part of the anti-Semitism smear campaign against Jeremy Corbyn and the left, who headlined an event for the Jewish labor movement, which, is misnamed. The Jewish labor movement is a right-wing group that worked very closely with the Israeli embassy to advance the goals of the Israeli government within the Labour Party and within the UK more broadly. So I think, again, we have to analyze where our strengths are and where the strengths of the opposition are. And our strength is in the, in building broad support, in building coalitions, building relationships with other anti-racist, progressive, grassroots movements in our countries. We're focusing on the UK and the US today, but also around the world. And in identifying Israel today as a rallying point for fascists around the world. Again, we could go into, we don't have time in this session, into the long history of Zionist cooperation with the right in Latin America, in the United States, in South Africa, and so on. But just today, in contemporary terms, you look at who are Israel's closest friends? Fascists and anti-Semites like Jair Bolsonaro, like Viktor Orban, like Donald Trump, like the neo-Nazi Alternative for Deutschland party, a party founded by literal Nazis, which is one of the most pro-Israel elements in modern-day Germany. So I'm just saying that to say we have to have a good analysis of the lay of the land to find out how we move forward, where our opportunities are to continue to build and strengthen support, despite the big setbacks we've had politically recently and the inevitable setbacks we will continue to have.
But if I could just quickly quote Miko, the late great trade union leader Bob Crow, he said, if you fight, you won't always win, but if you don't fight, you'll always lose. And I think we have to just keep going, really. And as Tony Benn said, just another quote, there's no such thing as a final victory or final defeat. Each generation has to fight the same battles over and over again. And I think those two great figures from the Labour movement in Britain should inspire us to keep going. And we can make progress. And Ali's made the point. on this issue anyway, I think we are making ground, and we are winning hearts and minds for the wider general public. And you know, we have to keep going, because it's the right thing to do. And like Bob said, you know, if we don't, we are going to definitely lose. If you don't fight, you'll always lose.
Yeah, it sounds like a good place to stop. It's been 2 hours, so I think, Jamil, we probably don't have time for any more questions. So I will just wrap it up by thanking all three of you gentlemen for a great discussion. I'm honored and very pleased that you all agreed to take your time and be part of this. Like Jamil said earlier, we're having a second part discussion because this is a big topic. Next week, the same time, same day, next Wednesday, same time, same channel. We're going to have Asa Winstanley from the UK, who also had an interesting experience with the Labour Party and the anti-Semitism issue. And he also writes for Electronic Intifada. And Esty Chandler, who is the board chair of JVP Action, and Anya Parampil, who is a reporter, a journalist, and works with Grey Zone. So once again, thank you all, and I hope that we'll have a good participation again next week. Jamil, did you want to say one more thing before we close?
Sure. So there will be a follow-up email going out with all the panelists' Twitter handles. So we encourage everybody to follow them and acquaint yourself with their work if you haven't already. Like Miko said, don't forget to register for part 2 of this event. I understand there were some limitations in the amount of people Zoom was letting in. So for next week's event, we're going to make sure that there is no limitation. People can come in. But again, these are going to be live streamed on Facebook. So you can always direct people there. And yeah, just go to mikopeled.com to register. And, you know, this hopefully won't be the last event we do. So we are planning some more events in the future. So if you can keep up with Miko's social media, you'll be aware of everything that's going on. And thanks again to our panelists for their contributions and insights. And yeah, stay safe, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Cheers. Solidarity. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right.
Bye now.